Educational and News for November 2025, Party of Communists, USA. In international news, PCUSA sent greetings to the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of India. The World Federation of Democratic Youth recently denounced the exclusion of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua from the 10th Summit of the Americas. The UN voted recently, overwhelmingly, to lift the blockade on Cuba, while the United States government again voted against the measure. In the Middle East, while the ceasefire in Palestine is still in place, there have been accusations the Netanyahu government is violating it. Domestically, the government has been shut down for over a month while the White House bails out Argentina for $40 billion USD and builds a multi-million-dollar new ballroom where the East Wing of the White House was. The educational takes place from Chapter 11 of Perils of Fascism by Henry Stevens and A.B. McGill. The Liberty League is dead. Huey Long lies in his ornate mausoleum in New Orleans. The Black Legion no longer makes newspaper headlines. But the menace of fascism in the United States is greater than ever. The forces which created the Liberty League and nurtured the Black Legion are still energetically at work, sometimes openly, more frequently in covert and devious ways, as seen with the MAGA movement, the Proud Boys, Patriot Front, and other groups. Their activities confront the American people with a political issue of the most critical importance, the issue of democracy or fascism. American democracy is threatened in as real and as compelling a sense as was German democracy in 1933. Whether the United States will succumb, as did Germany, to the Black Legions of fascism or move ahead towards a broader democracy is the question at stake. The one certain thing is that it cannot stand still. In the life and death struggle between the forces of democracy and fascism, the one or the other must advance. Secretary Ikes indicated the issue in his radio address of December 30th, 1937. Underneath the unchanging words of the institution, he said, underneath the unchanging appearance of our public institutions, there is happening here, as truly as in Europe and Asia, a struggle for power, for the control of lives, labor, and possessions of whole peoples, a struggle between the many and the few, a struggle between those who would live and let live, and those who want the thrill of the power of ruling others. Here in America, it is the struggle as old as time between the power of money and the power of democratic instinct. In the last few months, this irreconcilable conflict, long growing in our history, has come into the open as never before, has taken on an intensity which makes it clear that it must be fought through to a finish, until oligarchy or democracy, until America's 60 families or America's 340 million people win. There is simultaneously a growing tendency towards cohesion among progressive forces. The 1936 presidential election, which swept Roosevelt into office with over 27 million votes, demonstrated not merely the progressive temper of the people, but the growing political consciousness and independence of labor. In the recent decades and since, new independent labor and other organizations have emerged, like the Bernie Sanders movement and recently No Kings. And these, together with developing progressive movements within the old parties and older independent progressive groups, show the beginnings of forces that may coalesce into a single powerful democratic movement. This process is still in its early stages, but its direction is clear. The progressive movement, although still largely uncentralized, has been described with considerable reason as an embryonic People's Front movement. The nature of this trend has not been widely understood, however, because it assumes forms completely different from those of the People's Front movements in Europe. These distinct political forms are determined by the peculiarities of party politics in the United States, by the weight of American tradition, and by the size and complexity of the country. Here we have no large workers, farmers, or other middle-class parties. The Republican and Democratic parties, both equally dominated in post-war years by big capital, and both embracing within their ranks the vast majority of the oppressed and the exploited, have hitherto practically monopolized American politics. The growing Democratic movement cannot, therefore, assume the clear-cut alliance form of class parties, but instead develops in the complex form of progressive movements within the old parties, and to a lesser degree, in the form of regional independent labor, farmer labor, and progressive parties, such as the Working Families Party in New York. A national farmer labor party, representing an alliance of all progressive strata, appears to be most likely the American form of the People's Front. but the stage of development has not yet been reached. At the moment, the democratic movement consists of scattered progressive groups and tendencies, developing towards greater cohesion and unity. It represents the embryo of the People's Front, but not yet the People's Front. The coalescence of the scattered progressive forces and currents is therefore better described by the term Democratic Front. That growing Democratic Front movement expresses itself primarily in the form of progressive groups and tendencies within the old two parties, rather than in the form of independent parties, and this is due to the strength of the two-party system and the characteristics developed by the Democratic Party since 1933. The progressive features of Roosevelt's program encouraged progressives to remain within the Democratic Party rather than to seek new channels of political expression. This tendency is strengthened by the institution of primary elections and by the existence of state laws which obstruct the formation of new parties. The primary election creates the possibility of progressive victories within the two major parties and, therefore, tends to encourage dissident progressives to work within the old parties instead of launching new ones. Furthermore, the formation of new parties is retarded by state laws which require new parties to obtain large numbers of signatures or meet other difficult requirements before they can go on the ballot. The degree to which these general factors operate varies from state to state. In some states, reactionary political machines are so well entrenched and have developed corruption and gangsterism to such a fine art that nothing short of a political cataclysm can shake them from party control. Here, the Democratic Front cannot grow within the old parties and necessarily assume new forms. Elsewhere, development within the framework of the old parties is still possible. Similarly, election laws vary from state to state, rendering it easier in some states than in others for new parties to win places on the ballot. Signs of a new temper are evident everywhere. Farm, professional, and white-collar groups constituted a large part of the more than 4 million persons represented in the People's Congress for Peace and Democracy. Teachers and newspapermen's and technicians' organizations adopt progressive programs and ally themselves with the labor movement. Government employees and department store clerks, architect and hat-check girls, insurance salesmen, and waitresses join trade unions. Consumers' organizations spring up to combat high monopoly prices. Housewives picketed butcher shops demanding lower prices for meat. Progressive student movements grow in strength and influence. Clergymen from their pulpit denounce economic royalists. Progressive books pour from the presses, and progressive plays pack Broadway houses. These are the symptoms of a growing progressive split among broad sections of the population, certain, sooner or later, to find organized political expression. It is clear that a democratic revival is occurring among the American people, at the same time that the financial oligarchs repudiate democracy and move towards fascism. The general crisis of capitalism, expressing the severity of the economic crisis of 1929, 1933, and the uncertain character of the revival that followed, as it did in 2008 and today, drives the people into greater political activity, compels them to use their democratic rights in their own defense, and to shake off the apathy which permitted the Morgans, DuPonts, Rockefellers then, the Mellons, Kochs, Musk, and other oligarchs to rule now as they please. At the same time, the corporate overlords, determined to hold power at all cost, repudiate democratic processes which jeopardize their position and turn increasingly to fascistic methods of rule. Thus, the battle lines are forming in the new titanic struggle that will determine the fate of American democracy. The outcome of the struggle depends upon many factors, some of them as yet undiscernible, but undoubtedly the most decisive factor will be the energy, skill, and statesmanship with which the progressive forces meet the problems confronting them. The unification of the progressive forces will not occur automatically, but must be achieved through difficult and patient work by those in progressive vanguard who most clearly perceive the issues at stake and the manner of their solution.